He didn't bring Christianity to Ireland. He probably never saw a snake in his life, and his name wasn't even Patrick. Let's talk about Ireland's most famous saint. Eve Ganesha agus Fáilte. Hello and welcome. It's Misha Amy the Crafty Kylac, and it's been a minute. This is my YouTube channel where I make content about Irish history, folklore, food, and magic. I'll make another video explaining my impromptu 18-month hiatus, but today we're going to talk about Pat. So this came up on a recent live that I did on TikTok. So if you're not following me over there, you can check it out. But someone brought up St. Patrick in a live, and I just went off on a rant. I cannot stand a man getting credit for something he did not do. So first I'm going to go through 5 really prominent myths that we associate with St. Patrick still to this day. And then we're going to get into what actually happened or what we know happened, and then why we celebrate St. Patrick's Day in the first place. So myth number 1, the biggest one, he single-handedly brought Christianity to Ireland. That's just simply not true. There were Christians here well before Patrick. Multiple missionaries, including people like Palladius, who would have been the first bishop appointed to Ireland, were here before Patrick. The establishment of Palladius as bishop, which again I'll get into a little bit later, kind of solidified the fact that there were Christians here. So it's just simply not true. In his Confessio, even Patrick talks about how he feels like he doesn't know as much as the kind of the church elders because they would have grown up in the church. Myth number 2 is that he drove the snakes out of Ireland. Again, completely incorrect. There were never any snakes in Ireland to begin with. After the Ice Age, we never would have had snakes in Ireland. So that's just, again, not true. As my friend Lora O'Brien goes through in their video over at the Irish Pagan School, Druidry and druids would have existed long beyond Patrick. So the whole snakes were pagans thing is also not really true at all. Laura goes into a lot more detail about that in their video, so I will link that below so you can check that out after this one. But the whole snakes were pagans thing, even as a metaphor, doesn't really work. If you think about it, if druids in Ireland didn't have snakes in their surrounding area, why would they incorporate snakes as their symbol? And as Laura goes through in their video, the takeover of Christianity happened over time. So yeah, Patrick didn't single-handedly really do anything. There are a couple of stories about him fighting sea serpents or pace, but like who hasn't fought a sea serpent in ancient Ireland? Like Ireland has been without snakes for centuries, and it has been documented even hundreds of years before Patrick even got here. As early as the 3rd century, so like the 200s, a guy called Gaius Julius Solinus, probably pronounced that wrong, noted that we had no danger noodles in Ireland. Fast forward a few centuries and suddenly this legend about St. Patrick pops up saying that he's banished them. No. And actually, if we look at the earliest writings of saints in Ireland, the first mention of someone banishing snakes was actually St. Columba. So that account for St. Columba is around the 7th, 8th century. The references to Patrick dealing with any kind of serpents at all don't actually appear until the 12th century. So like 500 to 600 years later. And that comes from Jocelyn Furness, who in the 12th century wrote about Patrick and how Patrick drove the snakes into the sea. So Patrick didn't do anything with snakes. Myth number 3 is that his name isn't even Patrick. So while he would have used his Latinized name following his role in the church, he used Patricius, and Patricius means noble or nobleman, but also kind of ruler, and it would have come from the patrician class of people in Roman times, where they would have been, if you've heard of the word plebeian would have been the lower class people, and patrician would have been the noble people. So that's where he gets his name. But in hagiographies from the 7th century, hagiographies are saints' lives. So in the biographies that would have been written about him way after he died, for example, Tirchon's writings in the 7th century note that his titles include Magonus, which means famous, Socetus, which means god of war, and Patricius, which means noble. And a lot of people believe that he came from Wales, which is something that I would have heard growing up. But there are various different references to him living in places that would maybe be more like where modern day Scotland is, but it would have been Roman Britain, so there wouldn't have been necessarily the distinct names that we would know today. Myth number 4 is that his color is green. His color is actually blue. So the original color for Patrick and Ireland, as it happens, was actually blue. 5 is possibly the most shocking. He wasn't even a saint. Patrick was never formally canonized by the church. So back then, sainthood would have kind of been given out on a more regional or local basis. If a community thought someone was particularly holy, they typically venerated them. Even though it would have been really common practice, canonized officially, he is still venerated by a lot of churches, and many churches across the world state him as a saint. So if he wasn't canonized, if he didn't do anything with snakes, if he didn't bring Christianity to Ireland, what is the deal? What did he actually do? So when we're looking at this, there's lots of different resources that we can look at. And the Wikipedia page on St. Patrick, which I'll link below, gives a really good breakdown of all those sources and how things kind of changed over time and where certain folk tales and theories came from. But if we want to look at St. Patrick's own words and what he says he did, let's just look at his Confessio, which is available for free online translated, which I'll also link below. So the Confessio was sent to Rome as a confession. It was literally his confession saying that he didn't really think he had that much of an effect on Ireland at all. He was recounting his years as being taken to Ireland as a teenager, as a slave from Irish raiders, working as a shepherd, and then later hearing a voice telling him to escape. He then talks about his relationship with God, how that developed, and how he again heard a voice telling him to go back to Ireland and to return as a missionary. So he did baptize converts, he did ordain clerics, he wrote a lot about faith, and he preached a lot. He is very humble in this writing. He's very down on himself about what he didn't feel that he achieved, how he felt like the other more kind of elder and senior bishops, I suppose, would have had more of an influence, and he felt like he was lagging behind them because he had not grown up in the church. Like he converted when he was a teenager himself. So he felt like he was kind of starting on the back foot, I guess, and kept talking about his sins, all these sins he committed, and that he felt horrible for things he had done in his past. And he really just credited anything he actually accomplished to divine guidance and to his God. But he also did things, and again, this is part of his confession, is that he paid off Gaelic chiefs to pass on their land safely. He compared himself and what he felt his lack of knowledge was, and also his lack of experience in the church. So he was basically a mediocre Christian man with imposter syndrome. So why is he credited with all this stuff? The simple answer is church politics. So early Christian clerics in Armagh built a basically patrician cult, but it's not really like a cult, like a high control group, which we would kind of look at today, but it was more like a cult following. But you could argue that some Christian churches are cults, I guess. But that's a story for another day. Over time, hundreds of years after Patrick wrote his Confessio, hagiographies were written about him by other Christian clerics. Really elevated him to this kind of apostle of Ireland type figure, which overshadowed others like Palladius, who had arrived in Ireland before Patrick, and again was the first bishop that was sent to Ireland. Palladius is documented as reaching Irish shores around the year 431, with Patrick kind of noted as arriving a year later. So they're roughly arriving in Ireland about a year apart on their missions. But the exact timing of their arrivals will depend on which medieval source you look at as well. For example, Patrick has various different years of death that happen, some suggesting he lived to be 120, others suggesting he died much earlier. But the Irish annals give Patrick's arrival as 432, so a year after Palladius. However, we do have to kind of note that they were written hundreds of years after Patrick died. So there are theories from some scholars that suggest that the picking of Patrick arriving 1 year exactly after Palladius was actually a strategic move to kind of co-opt Palladius's work. So to make things even more confusing, Palladius is referred to in 457 as the elder Patrick in a record that says that that's when he died. And the Book of Armagh also refers to Palladius as Patrick to say that that's also something he was called. And given that Patrick or Patricius would have meant nobleman and kind of ruler and that kind of class element to it. I guess it would just be like calling a priest father, effectively what you were calling him. So, despite the fact that arrived in 431 and Patrick allegedly arrived in 432, we've no record of them ever meeting. And because earlier texts tend to kind of blend Patrick and Palladius's work, giving a lot of credit to Patrick for stuff, it's really weird in terms of the timeline. And also, given that Palladius would have been the bishop of the church that Patrick was a missionary for, surely they would have crossed paths, and surely we would have record of it if they did. In a text called the Chronicon, written in 431 by Prosper of Aquitaine, it states that Pope Celestine, who had been the Pope at the time in Rome, ordained Palladius and specifically sent him as the first bishop for the Scotti believing in Christ, suggesting that there was a Christian community in Ireland at the time. And then in a later work by Prosper called Contra Collatorum, around 2 years later in 433, he notes that while Celestine himself as Pope was busy keeping Roman Britain Catholic, he had also, in basically appointing Palladius, had made the barbarian island Christian, meaning Ireland, Hibernia, the land of forever winter. So by 433, we have this text that, while also called Ireland barbaric, which tended to happen quite a lot by various colonizers, in that text, Prosper also kind of suggests that the conquering of Ireland in terms of Christianity had already been somewhat successful. Why are we crediting Patrick with doing all this work when he didn't? Why are we even celebrating him? So St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March, started out as a feast day. So every saint has a feast day, and generally they're venerated on that day, and they will be mainly associated with certain locales as well. So there might be a St. Patrick's Church near you, a St. Patrick's Holy Well where he allegedly did some healing, and that's where you would go as a community with your local priest probably to do kind of mass and holy ritual. This was very common in Irish Catholicism. So Pattern Days or Patroon Days, patron saints days, were a really big deal in Ireland, where communities would come together, and still do to a certain extent, depending on the community and how attached they are to their local saint. There will be community gatherings on certain feast days, often organized by the church. But some local parishes would also have festivities that were happening also on that day. So the selection of the 17th of March is significant because that's allegedly when St. Patrick died. So often the feast day would be the day that the saint died. So St. Anthony's Day is like the 13th of June. You also then have St. Sheila's Day, which is the 18th of March, which I'll talk about in a second, and the links between allegedly Sheila and Patrick. But credit for specifically getting the 17th of March in the church calendar actually goes to a Waterford-born scholar. So Franciscan scholar Luke Wadding actually petitioned for St. Patrick's Day to be in the church calendar in the 1600s. So the whole thing with St. Sheila is that St. Sheila's Day, as well as St. Commonwealth's Day, are on the 18th of March. And there's a famous painting, well, kind of famous painting, I guess, if you're into this. But there's a painting that depicts from 1857 a Pattern Day celebration on the 16th, 17th, and 18th of March, believed to have been a collection of Pattern Day celebrations for the various saints across those days. So kind of like the Paddy's Day weekends that we have now, I guess. But St. Sheila's Day specifically wasn't really celebrated widely in Ireland necessarily, but would have been very much celebrated and is recorded in the 17 and 1800s in Irish diaspora communities in both North America, specifically Canada, and also in Australia, as being really big party days to celebrate the 18th of March, or St. Sheila's Day, who's in some folk tales believed to be St. Patrick's wife, but we don't have any reference to that. In his confessio, one of his confessions was not that he got married or he had relations with a woman named Sheila. Don't think that we can actually say for certain that they were ever a thing. Also, some people think that St. Sheila actually comes from the Sheila na gig, which are those stone carvings I did a video on a couple of years ago. So how did St. Patrick's Day get from a religious feast day in the 1600s in the Christian calendar, in the Irish Catholic calendar, to a worldwide global celebration of Irishness. So it might surprise you to find out that the earliest recorded parades that we have for St. Patrick's Day date back to the 1600s to St. Augustine, which would have been a Spanish colonized area, which would be where Florida is today in America. So an Irish vicar named Ricardo Artur was said to have organized a parade or procession for St. Patrick's Day celebrations. And that was the first recorded instance that we have of some kind of procession or parade on St. Patrick's Day. But then in the 1700s, specifically in Boston in 1737 and in New York in 1762, Irish immigrant communities came together to basically celebrate their shared heritage, celebrate their culture, and do it as immigrants that weren't beloved or accepted into their communities. So they took St. Patrick's Day as this day to celebrate Irish culture and celebrate what it meant to them to be Irish, and eventually turning it into a very big session, both in the music sense and also in the overconsumption of alcohol sense. Dyeing things green, projecting green lights everywhere, greening the globe. If we could maybe focus on greening the globe in a climate change way, we might be doing a bit better. So from a feast day of an Irish venerated saint to a celebration of Irish culture in the diaspora, back to Waterford, where Luke Wadding was from, and also where I'm from. The first St. Patrick's Day parade on Irish soil happened in my city of Waterford in 1903. And then the first state-sponsored parade came after the foundation of the Free State in 1931, when Dublin got its very first St. Patrick's Day parade. So while St. Patrick's Day very much gets the globe to think about Ireland and Irishness, can't really emphasize enough how the reason that those parades happened, immigrants from Ireland were facing hostility from the communities they were trying to integrate into. Big public celebrations, complete with dancing, music, lots of green things, became their way to foster community and keep their culture, traditions, and language alive in a very unfriendly environment. Over time, that sense of unity really morphed into the giant festivals and parades that we see today. But the modern takeaways I have for this, and what I really focus on St. Patrick's weekend, is the history of Irish emigration. Let's not forget, Patrick emigrated into Ireland himself, and the Irish have a long history of emigrating, still do to this day, to places who historically have taken us in, like North America, Australia, and the UK. And there are even more than ever emigrating because of the government's just refusal to deal with the housing crisis. But that's a rant for another day. While we're celebrating Irish culture and heritage, it's really important to understand how the Irish were perceived abroad, especially today when we're hearing so much anti-immigration and racist rhetoric. It's not so long ago that the Irish weren't even considered white or human. So we could do well to really remember our history, our heritage as immigrants, how the Irish diaspora was even formed, and also the things that we share, the experiences and culture that we share with marginalized communities. St. Patrick's Day has been widely celebrated globally since the 1990s, and really as a way to promote Irish culture, heritage, and tourism worldwide. The global greening of landmarks, from everything from the Eiffel Tower to the Sydney Opera House every year, is kind of impressive, actually. But it's just so ironic because, again, Patrick's color wasn't even green. I think when I talk about this a lot, I often kind of give out about Patrick being someone who didn't really do anything and got a lot of credit for stuff that they didn't do, which, happens to privileged white Christian men a lot of the time. But actually, it was the church itself and the propaganda and PR machine that the Church of Armagh was for Patrick is really why we believe all these myths today. And again, not to get back on my soapbox here, but if we're looking at historically the effect the Christian church has had through their propaganda in peddling misinformation and lies, and also through their actions upholding a patriarchy with this patricius character, we look at how Christian texts are being used today in the peddling of propaganda, rhetoric that is, and I say this as a pagan and former Catholic, not what Jesus was about. And honestly, I think the real Patrick, whoever that is, probably wouldn't be about that either. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and don't feel too bad if you've been taken in by a lot of these myths that are perpetuated every year around this time. Even in primary school, we learn about St. Patrick and all the stuff that he did that he didn't actually do. And then when you grow up and you get to dive back into all the resources and to actually read what actually happened, you get to learn the truth. So this St. Patrick's Day, let's stop giving men credit for stuff they didn't do and instead focus on what actually matters, which is Irish culture, heritage, and celebrating Irish diaspora across the world. If you like this video, make sure to give it a like because it helps boost it. Leave a comment if you have any questions, if there's any topic you'd like me to cover in the future, or if you have any thoughts, opinions on St. Patrick. I would love to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so you see when my next video is, which I promise will be soon. I have a lot of exciting content planned. I've been doing a lot of research over the last year or so. I just need to get time to film and edit these videos. But if you'd like to see more content from me, I have a whole load of videos on this channel, and I'm also posting a little bit more regularly over on TikTok. But until next time, Gurmil Malka Last Chaps, thank you very much for coming. Agus slán go fóill. See you soon.